What's up, guys? In this video, I'm going to show you how to take the square root of a negative number. And we're going to do that by using our imaginary unit I. I've hand selected these 5 examples to help you through the process. I hope you enjoy. All right, remember the principal square root where we talked about how can we rewrite the negative square root of a number with using I? Well, remember, I can break this down into the square root of 4 times negative 1. Then I can break that down into the square root of 4 times the square root of negative 1. Now remember, the definition of I, our imaginary number, was when we were trying to find the square root of negative 1. So therefore, now I can just evaluate square root of 4 as 2, and the square root of negative 1 is just going to be I. Now in this case, for this complex number, I don't have a real part. So it's actually just going to be my imaginary number, 2i. But however, in standard form, I can just write 2i for my problem, where my a, would be 0 in this case. So there you go. That's how you write in standard form. Ta-da! OK, so what I have here is I want to simplify this number by using I. So, man, I removed it. So remember that the square or the root of a product can be rewritten as the square root of a times the square root of b. And also remember that the square root of negative 1 equals I, our imaginary unit. So if I want to rewrite this, the first thing I'm going to do is want to break this up into the product and get out the negative 1 because we know that's going to represent I. So I can rewrite this as the product of square root of 7 times the square root of negative 1. Right? By applying this rule with my radical numbers, or applying the property, I understand that I can break that up into square root of 7 times the square root of negative 1. Now I'm going to want to simplify each of these numbers individually. Now the square root of 7 is an imaginary number. It's 2.645751 dot, 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 dot. It's going to go on and on and on forever, so I can't simplify this. However, the square root of negative 1 we recognize as I. So my final answer is just going to be the square root of 7 I. And just make sure when you're writing it like that, to be careful with that reg and make sure it doesn't go all the way over your I, because they're not taking the square root of I. It's the square root of 7 times I. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's how you simplify with I. Thanks.
All right, so there's a couple things we need to know about, at least dealing with the square root of negative 27. The first thing we want to do is we're going to try to simplify this. And one thing we notice is we can't take the square root of a negative number. Remember, the square root, if I'm looking at the square root of 4, that means 2, meaning that 2 times 2 is equal to 4. So if I have the square root of a negative number, well, there's no number that's multiplied by itself is going to equal something negative, because a negative times a negative and a positive times a positive are always going to equal a positive number. So what we have is what we're going to call imaginary numbers. And simplicity, we can just write the square root of a negative number, which we can rewrite as kind of 1, is going to be I. So for instance, if I said what is the square root of negative 4, well, what we could do is we could rewrite that as negative 1 times 4. And now I can take the square root, I can break that up into negative 1 times the square root of 4. Whereas the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of negative 1 we're representing as I. So therefore, this would be I times 2, or 2I. So it's important for us to know this. Very important for us to be able to do this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm automatically going to just rewrite this as the square root of negative 1 times 27. And now, by using my rules with radicals, I can break this up into negative 1 times the square root of 27. All right, so we know the negative 1 is going to equal I. But now what I did is I got rid of my negative. So now I just need to see if I can simplify 27. And there's a couple ways to do this. For this problem, I'll show you how to factor it. So what I can do is I can just factor 27. I can do 9 times 3, which, 27 is the same thing as the square root of 9 times 3, which is the same thing as 3 times 3 times 3. Well, now I know I can take the square root. When you have a pair, since we're dealing with square roots, the square root of a number times itself is obviously that number. So therefore, I'm going to have 3, and there's only one 3 over here, so it's going to be 3 radical 3 times the square root of negative 1, which is I. And usually we like to write 3 times I. 3I times radical 3. And that's going to be our final answer for that.
Welcome. So now what we're going to do is we're going to simplify the square root of negative 75. So again, we want to break this up into a product and break this negative into the -1. So I can rewrite this as the square root of 75 times the square root of -1. Now what I can do is I can work on simplifying each one of these radicals by themselves. So I know that the square root of -1, that's going to equal I. But now I need to see what is the square root of 75. Now 75 is not a square number, so I can't, it's going to be irrational, but I can simplify it further. And the way for me to simplify it is to break it up into another product with a square number. So I think of my square numbers, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64. Out of those numbers, what evenly divides into 75? Well, that's going to be the square root, that's going to be 25. And 25 divides into 75 3 times -1. And if we multiply all these numbers back, we're still going to have our product under a radical, and it better equal -75, which this does. However, now what I can do is I can simplify each one of these roots. So the square root of 25 we know is 5. Square root of 3 is going to remain square root of 3. And the square root of -1 is just going to leave us with I. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is how you simplify with using I. Thanks. Okay, so I picked simplifying the square root of -72 because this one offers a very important message for us to go and take a look at as far as determining how we're going to simplify this. So the first thing we're going to do is, again, we want to break this up into a product with -1 because we know that represents I. So therefore, I can have the square root of 72 times the square root of -1. All right, now we need to break up the square root of 72, and I'm going to do this 2 different ways because a lot of students, when they get to this point, they just want to look at, well, what are the most obvious numbers that we know divide into 72, right? And they might say, oh, well, actually, I'll even look at this another way. Square root of 72. 72, so you could say 3, 20, 24. Actually, that was still even working that. Not even going to go through that. All right. So a lot of times they might say, oh, well, that's very obvious. That can be broken down into the square root of 8 times the square root of 9. But then we want to say, well, can we continue to simplify this? We can simplify the square root of 9 into 3, right? Because we know we had to make sure we broke it down into a square number. But then the square root of 8, we can also break that down even further to the square root of 4 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 3. I'm sorry, not the square root of 3, times 3. Then we know that this is going to be 2 times square root of 2 times 3. And this equals 6 times the square root of 2. So you have to keep on breaking it down. So the hint that I want to give you is when you're determining out of your square numbers what is going to divide into 72, how to break it up, the best advice that I can give you is choose the largest number that is going to divide evenly into your number. All right? And it has to be, when we're talking about largest number, I'm talking about square numbers. So we know that 9 divides into 72, but 9 is not the only square number that we have that evenly divides into 72. Our actual largest is going to be 36, and 36 divides into 72 2 times. And then I can easily take the square root of 36, which is going to give me 6, times 2. So it's very important that, one, we have to pick our square numbers, but then also we want to pick the largest square number to divide into our term, so therefore we can simplify it. There you go. Thanks.